The Atlas 6, Chapter 5, Parisa, 1 hour ago. She'd been sitting in the bar in her favorite black dress, sipping a martini. She always came to do this alone. For a time she'd been in the habit of having girlfriends around, but ultimately determined they were too noisy, disruptive, often jealous too, which Parisa couldn't abide. She'd had one or two female friends at school in Paris, and had once been close to her siblings in Tehran. But since then, she'd determined she was better as a singular object. That made sense to her ultimately. People who lined up to see the Mona Lisa typically couldn't name the paintings hanging nearby, and there was nothing wrong with that. There were quite a lot of words for what Parisa was, which was something she supposed most people would not approve. Perhaps it went without saying that Parisa didn't put a lot of stock in approval. She was talented and smart, but above that, at least according to everyone who'd ever looked at her, she was beautiful, and being gifted approval for something that had been handed to her by some fortu- fortuitous, fortuitous arrangement of DNA instead of earned by her own two hands wasn't something she felt necessary to either idolize or condemn. She didn't rail against her looks, didn't give thanks for them either. She simply used them like any other tool, like a hammer or a shovel, or whatever else was necessary to complete the requisite task. Besides, disapproval was nothing worth thinking about. The same women who might have disapproved were quick to fawn over her diamonds, her shoes, her breasts, all of which were natural, never synthetic, not even illusioned. Whatever they wanted to call Parisa, at least she was authentic. She was real, even if she made a living on false promises. Really, there was nothing more dangerous than a woman who knew her own worth. Parisa watched the older men in the corner, the ones in the expensive suits who were having a business meeting. She'd listened for a few minutes to the subject of conversation. After all, not everything was sex. Sometimes insider trading was the easier option, and she was smart enough to serve multiple threats, but ultimately lost interest, as a business concept was fundamentally unsound. The men themselves, however, remained intriguing. One of them was toying with his wedding ring and fussing internally about his wife. Boring. One of the others was clearly harboring some sort of unresolved sexual angst about the boring, fussy one, which was more interesting, albeit unhelpful for her purposes. If you hear slight lisp, that's just my elastic. So sorry about that. Oh my days. Yeah. One of the others was clearly harboring. Sorry, the last one was more handsome, probably rich, a tan where his wedding ring should have been. Parisa shifted in her chair, crossed one leg delicately over the other. The man looked up, catching a glimpse of her thigh. Well, he was certainly willing, that much was clear. She looked elsewhere, not sure the man would be ending his business meeting anytime soon. In the meantime, she'd occupy her thoughts with someone else's. Maybe the wealthy woman in the back corner who looked likely to cry any minute. No, too depressing. There was always the bartender who certainly knew how to use his hands. He had pictured them on her already, travelling over a fairly accurate mental illustration of her hips. Only she wouldn't get anything out of that. An orgasm, surely, but what good was that? An orgasm she could have on her own without becoming the girl who fucks bartenders. If anyone was going to be involved in Parisa's life, they were going to bring money, power, or magic. Nothing else would do. She angled herself towards the dark-skinned man at the end of the bar, contemplating the silence that came from his head. She hadn't seen him come in, which was unusual. A medium, then, or at least a witch. That was interesting. She watched him toy with a slim card, tapping it against the bar, and frowned at the words. Atlas bleakly, caretaker. Caretaker of what? Sorry. The problem with being a smart girl was being naturally curious. Parisa turned away from the business meeting, aiming herself instead towards Atlas Blakely and fiddling with their respective positions in the room, turning the volume up. She focused in on his mind and saw 6 people. No, 5. 5 people, without faces. Extraordinary magic. Ah, yes, he was definitely a medium. And so were they, it seemed. He felt a kinship with one of the 5. One of them was a prize, something the man, Atlas, had recently won. He felt a bit smugger over it. 2 of them were a set. They came together. They didn't like being shoved in like twins in a too small room, but too bad. That's what they were. Or one was a vacancy, a question, the edge of a narrow cliff. Another was the answer, like an echo, though she couldn't quite see why. She tried to see their faces clearly, but couldn't. They walked in and out of view, beckoning her closer. Parisa peered around, pacing a little inside his thoughts. They seemed curated, a bit like a museum, as if they'd been intended for her to view in a particular order. A long process of selection, then a mirror, 5 frames with hazy portraits, and then a mirror. Parisa looked at her own face and felt startled. At the end of the bar, the man rose to his feet, placing the card in front of her, and without him detailing anything aloud, she already knew why he'd given it to her. She'd spent long enough in his mind to understand it, and she realized now that he'd willingly let her in. In 1 hour, his thoughts said, the card would take her somewhere important. It was obviously the most important place in the world to this man, whoever he was. That bit Parisa suspected was her interpretation, as it was slightly fuzzier. She knew instinctively that whatever it was, it would be more worthwhile than the man having the business meeting. That man had recently repaired stitching in his suit. It had been refitted, it wasn't new. A man wore a new suit into a business meeting like this if he could afford it, and that man couldn't. Parisa sighed in resignation, picking up the card from the bar. An hour later, she sat in a room with Atlas Blakely and 5 people she'd seen hazily represented in his mind without either of them speaking a word to each other, friendly or otherwise. She watched the handsome Latin boy, definitely a boy. He was obsessed with the girl sitting next to Parisa, who was tinted with inexperience. Decided she was beautiful, and she smiled to herself, knowing perfectly well she could eat that boy alive, and he'd let her. He'd be fun for a day, also maybe. But this seemed bigger than that. This seemed much more important. The blonde South African was interesting. He was eyeing the Englishman Tristan with extreme curiosity, possibly even something ravenous. Good, Parisa thought, pleased. She didn't like men like him. He'd want her to shout his name, to scream about his dick, to say things like, oh baby, yes, how do you do it, how do you make me feel like this, and that was a chore. It rarely ended in anything worthwhile. Rich people like him typically held tight to their wallets, and experience had taught her that did her no good. Besides, the 6 of them were equals here. He had nothing to offer her, except perhaps loyalty, but he wasn't the type to give it easily. He was used to getting his way, which she could see from observing the functions of his thoughts was something he did with at least some level of intention. Parisa Kamali has never wanted to be under anyone's thumb, and she certainly wouldn't start now. The boy, too, was probably useless, which was disappointing. He was obviously wealthy and certainly not unattractive. Nicolas, she thought, with satisfaction, rolling his name around in her head like she might have done with him, whispering it to the inch of skin just below the lobe of his ear. But he obviously tired quickly of things that were too easily won. Not Parisa's style. The girl he fixated on was equally easy to discard, though Parisa had been with girls before and rarely ruled them out. She spent the better portion of last month, in fact, with a wealthy Malta heiress who'd bought Parisa this outfit, these boots, this purse. People were all the same, really, when you got to the chore of them, and Parisa always did. It was Parisa's business, seeing things she wasn't supposed to see. In this case, though, this particular girl was unequivocally hopeless. She had a boyfriend she seemed to actually like. She had good intentions too, which was the most unfortunate. Always indicative of someone not easily put to use. The girl, Libby, was so good she was no good at all. Parisa moved on from her quickly. Raina, the naturalist with the nose ring, was easily the most threatening presence in the room. She radiated raw power, which in Parisa's experience was the mark of someone who shouldn't be messed with. Parisa put her in a mental box marked Do Not Disturb and resolved to stay out of her way. Then there was Tristan, the Englishman, whom Parisa liked within moments of slipping unobtrusively into his thoughts. There was a festering anger in his head, beating dully like a tribal drum. It was obvious he didn't know why he was here, but now that he wanted to punish everyone in the room, himself included. Parisa liked that. She found it interesting, or at least relatable. She watched Tristan notice everything that was off in the room, all the illusions everyone else had used to hide various parts of themselves, which varied from Libby's little spot of concealer on a stress blemish hidden by her fringe to the false golden fleck tips of Callum's hair, and marveled a little at his instant dismissal. He was unimpressed. He changed his mind, Parisa thought, if she decided she wanted him to, which wasn't to say she did necessarily. Again, there was nothing in it for her to to pursue someone who provided no leverage. Perhaps the most beneficial connection was in fact the caretaker, Atlas. Parisa was already calculating how much work it would take to win Aldous Blakey's interest when the door opened behind him and she and the others turned. Ah, Dalton, said Atlas, a narrow-hipped, elegantly lean man, perhaps a few years older than Parisa and dressed in a clean-starched Oxford with lines as precise as the sleek part of his raven black hair, nodded in reply. Atlas, he said with a low voice, his gaze falling on Parisa. Yes, Parisa thought, yes, you. He thought she was beautiful. Easy, everyone did. He tried not to look at her breasts. It wasn't really working. She smiled at him, and his thoughts raced, then went blank. He was momentarily silent, and then Atlas cleared his throat. Everyone. Dalton Ellery, Atlas said, and Dalton nodded curtly, looking over Parisa's head to glance with a somewhat forced smile at the others in the room. Welcome, he said. Congratulations on being tapped for entry to the Alexandrian Society. His voice was smooth and buttery despite his posture being slightly stiff. His broad shoulders, the result of considerable craftsmanship, for which Parisa was certain his shirts were specially tailored, appearing to lock uncomfortably in place. He was clean-shaven, meticulous. He looked fanatical about cleanliness, and she wanted to Sorry, I thought I heard something. Press her tongue to the nape of his artfully tapered neck. I'm sure you all understand by now what an honor it is to be here. Dalton is a member of our most recently initiated class, Atlas said. He'll be guiding you through the process, helping you transition into your new positions. Parisa could think of a few positions she needed no assistance with whatsoever. She slid into Dalton's subconscious, probing around. Would he want a chase, or would he prefer her to be the aggressor? He was blocking something from her, from everyone, and Parisa frowned, surprised. It wasn't unheard of to practice some method of defense against telepathy. There was an effort, even for a medium with a considerable amount of talent. Was there someone else in the room Dalton was expecting could read his mind? She caught a flicker of a smile from Atlas, who arched a brow at her and blinked. Oh, she thought, and his smile broadened. Perhaps now you know what it's like for other people, Atlas said, and then added carefully, and I would advise you to stay away from Dalton. I will be advising him to do the same. Does he usually follow your instructions? Parisa asked. His smile was unerring, I don't know. Yes, and as you should. And the others, I can't prevent you from doing whatever it is you'll do over the course of the year, but even so, there are boundaries, Miss Kamali. She smiled in concession, wiping her mouth clean. Defense, offense. She was equally skilled, and in response, Atlas nodded once. Well, he said, shall we discuss the details of your initiation then?